Scientific method, lecture number 2. So you're probably all familiar with the scientific method. We're just going to go a little bit more detail, and we're going to talk about how it relates to what we're doing this semester. Right? So if we look at this scientific method, the scientific method to me is a way that we go about answering questions that we have about the things we see. Right? So I think of it as this sort of cyclical process. Right? We're always observing things, which is causing us to ask questions. So the top here, we're making some observations, which is allowing us to ask some questions. Why is this occurring? So the second step, once we make an observation, is we ask this question. The next step, we're going to propose some explanation for those observations that we see. So we see something we don't understand, we ask a question about that observation, and then we sort of propose what is causing that observation. Right? We're proposing a model, some explanation for this observation. And the degree at which of understanding we have is sort of going to define what we call this model. But they're all just a simplification to answer the question that we're seeing. Right? The next thing we're going to do is we're going to experiment. So we're going to take this model and we're going to apply it to the observations we see. We're going to test it, right? And see if then during this experiment we're going to do some more observations and this cycle repeats. So say we do an observation, we ask ourselves a question. The first time we go through that, we're going to call this a hypothesis. Right? It's a testable explanation that explains our observations. Right? So one key thing about a hypothesis is they have to be testable. Right? So we have to be able to, they have to be simple enough that we can test for one thing. Based on what we're seeing, we think this is happening, which we're able to test this single observation. Once we go through that process and sort of a multiple hypotheses, the larger picture, we end up with this model. It's a simplified conceptual picture to explain a natural phenomenon. So we are then having a sort of a broader understanding than we call it a model. The first time we can develop a model, but typically we have to go through several iterations of this process before we think about that as being a model. Right? We typically will then talk about natural laws, like the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of gravity. Those started out as hypotheses, but they've gone through this cyclical process many, many, many times. So we can say that these hypotheses explain the natural observations extremely well, right? They've been highly tested, and at which point, once we have a large foundation of knowledge behind them, then we make these hypotheses or these predictions into what we call laws, right? We can't really ever prove anything in this process. We can sort of contradict things, right? So the major goal of this observation or the scientific method is to support our hypotheses or our models, right? We're not really proving anything, we're just supporting them. We can disprove things fairly easily, but we can't prove them. Right? So we're always gaining more and more support. The difference between a simple hypothesis and a law is the support we have for those ideas. Right? Hypotheses, we may have very little support. A law, like the first law of thermodynamics, we have a large amount of support for, that we would be very surprised if we can find a prediction or make an observation that counteracts that rule. Right? So when we talk about this scientific method, it's really a cyclical process. That's what we want to understand. We're always making observations, asking questions, and then sort of forming explanations for those, which we can then perform an experiment to make observation, and the cycle repeats. And that's what we're going to be doing more in the lab component necessarily than the lecture, but that's what we're going to be doing when we study this chemistry. It's going through this cyclical process.
Dad, I done did it.